Welcome to Blitzscaling a Startup. I'm Julian Newman.
And I'm Chris Yeh.
And we are live on LinkedIn, Chris. I've been trying to make this LinkedIn
exciting.
thing work. But finally, I found the workaround. The main place where anyone watches us live is LinkedIn. So it's very annoying.
Well, I'm glad we got the workaround working.
And Chris, you were just on a vacation in where was it? It was Hawaii?
Maui, in Hawaii, on the island of Maui.
Okay. Yeah, you were in the Bahamas, now you for work. Now Maui. I'm very jealous.
Yeah, no, it's nice to be in these sort of tropical areas. And as I mentioned to you, I don't know if I'd want to live in a tropical area, but it's a good place for relaxation, right? It's a slower pace of life. There's just less going on. People aren't in as much of a rush. And so it's great for relaxation, probably less great for starting a company.
So, okay, our topic today is how to be a high ROI person. And this is something we discussed last week. So folks want to check out the previous podcast episode. It's, something we touched on a little bit. The general idea is like in life, it's going to be a lot easier to get other people to go along with what you're doing if you make it ridiculously easy for them to do that. And more than that, it's like high ROI. So it means easy and valuable for them.
That's right.
And I'll let you give, your overview of why this is important. Then we can dig into it in more detail.
Well, I think that the reason this is important is it helps you see the world through other people's eyes. And it means that you're thinking about the motivations of your counterparties instead of just focusing entirely on what you care about. That's one of the mistakes that people often make. They focus on their own needs, their own motivations, and they make decisions based on that without stopping to think, well, how does this interact with other people's needs and motivations as well? There is one other approach, which is when people, for a variety of reasons, sort of always put other people's needs first, but that's also not a good solution because, again, you still ultimately need to achieve your goals as well. So I like to think of it as a balanced approach to figuring out how do we get things done in this world. Now, as you point out, ROI is return on investment. And so there's two primary components, the return and the investment. And if you think about it from the other person's perspective, the return is how important is this and how much does it move the needle? And the investment is how much of a hassle is this? Now, you may think to yourself, gosh, this seems like a lot of work to be a high ROI person. I've got to think about it from other people's point of view. I've got to make it as easy as possible for them. And my response to that is you should be glad that it's hard because that's why so few people do it and why you can stand out if you do it. So let's talk about being a high ROI person in the context of something very concrete. And we're not going to talk about it in terms of, my life today, although we could. We're going to talk about it in terms of things that are relatable to folks that are young and just starting out who could benefit the most from this advice. So if you think about how you learn when you're growing up, you have very little opportunity to change the I, in the sense that you're asked to perform on tests, on papers and projects and things like that. And the investment is the same. It's a structured thing, which is just handed to you. And then you work on it. And however well you execute, that's the return. And the investment is fixed. And so as a result, many people really focus on the return element of it. And they expect someone else to tell them what that grading rubric is. That's where it breaks down in real life, because in real life, people don't always tell you what they want. People don't always even know what they want. And the investment involved is going to vary widely depending on how you structure things. And so when you get into the real world, instead of saying, well, I'm just going to be the top achiever, I'm going to get the highest score, you have to think instead about, okay, all of us are actually tackling different problems. We have the choice of which problem to tackle. So we have to choose wisely and find one where the value is high. And the investment also varies widely as well, because it's not like things are being served up to us on a silver platter, right? The reason school works is it's so tightly structured and so much of the work has already been done that you can just get a problem and just work on the problem and focus purely on that problem. In real life, it's very different. You've got to find the problems, you've got to structure them yourselves. And then, in terms of what you ask other people to do, you've got to structure that as well. So that's why the whole thing breaks down. But going back to, concrete example, when I was early in my career at DE Shaw and Company, I remember that there was a problem that we were dealing with. I was working on a project where we were building an online brokerage, and we took the online brokerage application and we converted it into a website, and it was a 17-step process to complete the application. And needless to say, not many people made it all the way through. And so I went to the VP of engineering and I said, "Hey, Paul, this is a 17-step process. Right? How on earth are we expecting people to finish this? I mean, they just not going to have the patience to do this." And Paul said, "Well, I mean, we took the form and we translated it. This is what the situation is. What are we going to do about it?" And I said, "Well, let me think about it a little bit." So first thing is identify this problem. And the problem was clearly a 17-page application process is not good if you want people to actually complete it. And I did what I think people would typically do in their educational career, which is I pointed out the problem to the authority figure. And the authority figure basically, instead of doing what a teacher or principal would do, which is I'm paid to deal with these things, said, "I don't know," right? Shrug emoji. That is what it is. I mean, is there an answer? I have no idea, because he's busy. He's worrying about how to keep a team of a dozen engineers working hard. And here I am. I've come and brought him a problem, and he doesn't know exactly what to do about it. But he's like, I don't have time for this. All right. Well, if I had limited myself to traditional student style thinking, maybe that would have been the end of it. But what I said instead is, I think that this is a very important problem, because if we're building an online brokerage and people can't finish their application, we're not going to get customers and this is going to fail. So this is pretty important. The return is high. And now I have to figure out how to make the investment on Paul's side low. Now, I presented him with the problem, and I was hoping he would solve it. He wasn't willing to make the investment to solve it. So I'm going to have to make that investment and see if I can solve it as well. And so I sat down with the application, the paper application, and I sort of broke it down into the individual steps and drew sort of like arrows to show which decisions led to which changes. Because again, in order for it to work with a paper form, they had to take into account all the different possibilities and branches. And so I sat down and I drew all those arrows and I put them down onto Post-it notes, and I moved those Post-it notes around until I felt like I had managed to reduce it down. And I think I'd reduced it to 5 or 6 steps. And it took a couple of hours of work. But when you think about the fact that this is going to be used by every single customer of your product, then obviously it's a pretty high ROI for those customers for me to make this better. And then I took this giant sheet, which I had taped a bunch of pieces of paper together and put these Post-it notes and came through and drew lines. And I brought it to Paul. I said, "Paul, I think we can reduce it to 6 steps. Still a lot, but 6 is a lot better than 17. And I walked him through it. And he said, "Wow, you're right." And what he did then is he assigned it to one of my friends who was a top engineer and an even more structured thinker than I am. And he managed to reduce it to 4 steps. But he wouldn't have been asked to do that if I hadn't made this high ROI proposal to his boss, which was, that this is a high return, but I'm also serving up the solution to you on a silver platter. So your investment is now low enough to make this a no-brainer. And that's the key. Right? We're always focused on the return. It's very rare. Of course, you need to focus on something that's important, but you usually know what's important. What you aren't necessarily in the mindset of doing is figure out, how do I serve this up on a silver platter to the decision maker? So all they have to do is say yes.
I love your example because a sign up form is actually a great analogy for how that everyone can relate to because we've all used them.
Yeah.
For how you should act as a person, right? It's just like you want to be really easy to sign up, and then you want to sign up to be like really valuable and to like immediately get value when you sign up for this product. And that kind of like I'm signing up for this new product experience should be low investment, high return.
Yeah.
And what you were describing is that the way it was structured was there was a high investment and presumably insufficiently high return. So it's such a great example.
Yeah. And again, you can apply this in so many different ways. The fact is that people pay for convenience. They pay all the time, right? Yeah, obviously, just take cooking. It doesn't take much to cook. I mean, you probably cook. I certainly cook. And it doesn't take much to cook, and it's much cheaper than buying food. And yet people will buy food at restaurants all the time. And it's not even always for some amazing experience that they couldn't otherwise get. It's simply because it's convenient. And if you are a purveyor of convenience, you'll have a lot of customers. If you're a purveyor of complexity and struggle, you probably won't. And so it just makes sense in life. If you're a high ROI person, and again, ROI from the other person's perspective, you're always going to have people who want to work with you.
And I want to kind of pause here to talk about the benefits because you're kind of like alluding to them of being a high ROI person. I know for me personally, I had to develop this skill when I worked in a political party where, I dealt with, some of the wealthiest people in Canada, some of the most powerful people in Canada, where I was from, and, top political leaders. And I was really young, and, their bias was to ignore me or to like not take me seriously. And if I want them to do anything, it's like, hey, this has to be the most the easiest and best use of my time possible by a long shot, and obviously so. And so what the benefit was for me of kind of like learning to become a person who's high ROI to interact with is I was able to work with some of the most powerful, smartest people in the country I was from, at least. And I assume for you've had like similar experiences.
Absolutely. And the way to think about this is it's also a snowball. So when you began in your political career, people didn't know who you were. And I'm not sure it was difficult at times to convince people to go along with various courses of action. But you made the case compellingly, and they started going along. And I'm willing to bet that as you developed a reputation for being a guy who got things done, people are like, hey, Julian Newman makes things happen. Pretty soon, people were far more willing to just sort of say, oh, Julian's calling. Let me pick that up. He had an email. Let me respond to that. And they are far more likely to say, when you explain, I think you should do this, they'd say, okay, that sounds good. And so there is a longer term reputational benefit to being a high ROI person. Now, one of the things I like to point out to folks about people who are rich and powerful and famous and all these other things is that they tend to have a lot of resources. So resources are not their primary constraint. The primary constraint is how much of their own time and energy they have to spend on something. And so being a high ROI person is a way of reducing those things, right? Just serving it up on a silver platter makes it easy for them to say yes. And unlike a regular person like you or I, the price tag doesn't fit into that. They don't want to be ripped off. But what really matters is this going to move the needle, and how much of my own effort am I going to have to spend? If I have to spend some money to do this, so be it. That's easy.
I think another example of the benefits of being high ROI is our podcast. And, what I do is I do everything that I can to make your experience as a co-host as easy and as valuable as possible. So, for example, I was thinking, hey, Chris seems to like talking to these Afrobeats artists. Maybe we could reach out to folks in the NBA because Chris also likes the NBA and basketball, and can we set something up that would, be really valuable for him and unique. So I'm just always looking for opportunities to, create more value for you through our interactions and through our activities. And on the other hand, it's kind of like the return part. On the other hand, I we do, like, right before we do our live streams, the reason we're often late is that I pack in any coordination overhead into that one block hour, specifically so that, like, I'm not emailing you throughout the week. So, people, there's coordination. I tell people,
Yeah.
hey, we're gonna have to wait till Friday. I'll get back to you and I'll confirm. And that means that you just never think about this except for 1 hour a week. And then when you get there, everything happens and it's super valuable and it's interesting. And by making it that way, it keeps you engaged. And for me, the benefit is that, I get to collaborate with you on this.
Mhm.
Presumably, if you had to, deal with me every day about something, and it was just like even if it was pleasant interactions, uh, and everything, there were always problems, and it was, high friction, or you would just, prioritize something else.
Yeah. And again, I think that there is a valuable meta point to be extracted here, which is if your interactions are clear, synchronous, and short, then that is beneficial and attractive. Why is it? Because you are minimizing the time, but you're also minimizing the mental overhead, right? We all go through life with like little nagging reminders in our head. We need to do this. We need to do this. We need to do this. The joy of just showing up is incredible. And that's something that you're providing in this podcast form. And hopefully it shows up in the fact that I'm enthusiastic and eager to jump in and help out whenever I can.
Yeah, and I guess another example, and maybe you can share, like, I don't know what extent you're comfortable sharing this, but
Mhm.
some details on, like, how you collaborate with Reed, or how
Sure.
you collaborated with Reed when you co-authored Blitzscaling, and how, like, some things that you did that made that higher ROI for him, who's obviously extremely solicited.
Yeah, no, and this is something I talk about in public all the time. So there's no secret about it. When people would ask us, well, how does the writing process work? How do you guys work together on this? Because when people are co-authors, they could do it in any number of different ways. And what we do is we first start off just talking. And I often use the analogy that I remember from the great Professor Seth Lehrer, who is an English professor at Stanford. I believe he's still there, and I learned from him Chaucer and Middle English. And one of the great images I will forever remember in my mind is him describing the great blind poet John Milton. And John Milton would, in the middle of the night, compose the stanzas for his great work, Paradise Lost, and of course, the sequel, Paradise Regained. And in the morning, when everyone else woke up, since he was a blind poet, he couldn't really write things down. He would call out to his very indulgent daughters, and he would cry out to them and say, milk me, so that he could get the ideas out onto paper, and they would act as his secretaries and put them out there. And I shared that with Reed. He thought it was a funny analogy, although perhaps a little disturbing at times, because the goal is to milk Reed of insights and thoughts, which he just puts out all the time. And so we start off by talking about things and just what's on his mind and what are things that he's learned recently. And as we're going through, I'm taking notes, and occasionally he'll recognize the signs as I do something like this. My fingers will sort of like make a little motion like that. It means that my spider sense is tingling, saying, I think that there's something to that particular point that we should elaborate. But the point is, Reed doesn't have to do much planning in advance. Of course, he puts down notes. He has a whole file of things to talk with Chris about when we get together, but he doesn't have to. He can just sit there and react and provide his thoughts. And by keeping that interaction clear and synchronous and as short as necessary, It's possible to get a lot of good stuff out. And so we'll do that. And then based on that, I'm going to go off and take a bunch of notes and say, okay, I think that's interesting. And I might write something along those lines and then bring it back and have Reed take a look at it. And he can react to it in the moment. And by the way, this is one of those things where, in theory, it would be more efficient for me just to email it to Reed and for Reed to read through it asynchronously and respond to it. But then that would require him to have to think about when he was going to do that. And instead, what is easier is for me to say, okay, here's the thing I want you to review today. And he will look at it and make edits and changes. And meanwhile, while that's going on, I'll work on something else. And then we can immediately turn to it if he has questions or, has reactions and things, and just handle it synchronously, just like you and I are talking about with this podcast. So I guess the message is, yeah, these are the same techniques that Reed and I use to work together, because my goal is to make Reed's time as leverageable as possible, also as fun as possible, but as leverageable as possible. And so it'll be the same things. It's like, hey, how do we focus on making sure that what we're doing together is fun and productive?
Yeah, so there's, I think, a really important component to at least reducing the investment, which was non-obvious to me, and I feel is non-obvious to most people, which is the like what you call what do you call it?
Serving up on a silver platter?
No, it's so it's kind of like reducing the context switching, and
yes,
it's like the you have a term for this. I forget, but kind of like reducing the context switching and the kind of like mental effort that people need to make.
Exactly. Reducing the either cognitive load or reducing the amount of executive function required.
Allowing
people to do what they do best, as opposed to having to adapt to you. And this is another great meta point, which is to be a high ROI person, what you are ideally doing is adapting to the other person. You are adapting to their particular way of working, their particular quirks. And you do that because it is more effective for you and allows you to get more out of the person rather than trying to train them into doing something else. I mean, again, you could try to train someone else. I'm sure, you might have gently nudged some of the political leaders that you worked with over time, but by and large, you would adapt to them, because their time was super valuable and you needed to just make that time as valuable and as leverageable as possible.
Yeah, an example that immediately comes to mind is this guy, Tom, who I worked with. He was an amazingly productive person, right? Like he would just get more done than anybody else in the political party that we worked in. Like he was just a workhorse. And what would happen is that he would run out of things to do, right? So most politicians, like, they're really lazy and they're kind of scattered and all over the place. They can't do anything. Tom would actually get stuff done. And at some point, he'd kind of like run through his pile of things that he had to do. And he's like, well, I have nothing else to do. And that was annoying to him because, somebody had very high standards for himself and he wanted to be getting stuff done. So he never kind of like voiced this. What we would do is we would kind of like create lists, like backup tasks that he could do if ever he had extra time.
Right.
Which is not at all how you would work with most politicians. But with him, that was, really, really, really important. And that was just like adapting to his style.
That's right. And, again, this is something that you've learned from working with me, and other people who don't work with me repeatedly don't necessarily know this. But what is very common when somebody has a speaking engagement, they're on a panel, they're going to do some fireside chat or something like that, is they want to know all the questions in advance because they want to prepare for it, because that makes them feel more comfortable. And I always tell everyone, you can send me things, I probably won't read them, because I don't have a need to do that. And so why would I spend time doing something when there is no R on the I? And so, that's why you send me the emails, but you're like, yep, but he probably won't read them. And then we'll just deal with them when the time comes. And that's okay, right? It's not, some people would say it's a sign of laziness. Shouldn't you do this extra work? I'm like, doing work that doesn't actually produce a better result is senseless. Work has no inherent value. Only results have value.
Yeah, and mostly for me, right? Like, if this is not something you want to do, then if I'm trying to be maximally high ROI, then I should adapt, right? That's just how it needs to be. And
Right.
like an example that um, you may have noticed, this is a question I have for you. So
Hmm.
last time when you spoke, we did this last week.
Yeah.
You mentioned something about how you introduce yourself as Chris Yeh, and I just say Julian.
Yes.
And this week, I introduced myself as Julian Newman.
I noticed
Not
that.
because I, yeah, well, not because I feel one is better than the other. It's more like it's a point of friction, and it's not a big point of
No,
friction,
not at all.
right? It's a really, really small, non-important thing, but it is a point of friction that I can remove. And what I do when I engage with you or a lot of different people is kind of like seek out these points of friction that I can remove proactively. Um, Not because it matters. Like, you don't care if I introduce
Right.
myself as Julian or Julian Newman. Actually, I should change my. It says Julian
I
here, so
see
I'm kind
that.
of
Yes.
undermining my own point. But
I had
that's
noticed
just
that
like
as
the
well, but I
automatic
wasn't going to
thing.
bring it up.
That's the automatic thing on StreamYard. So I'll change it afterwards. But it's kind of like constantly looking for things. I don't know, like how important, because it, in a way that seems trivial. I'm noticing that something that I instinctively do. Like, how trivial is that? Slash, how important is that?
Well, this is a classic example of the green M&M principle. So there's a very famous story, possibly apocryphal. I think it's actually true, but you never know with famous stories, about the band Van Halen. And Van Halen's a very famous band, and they had a famous thing in their touring contracts which stated that in their dressing room, there would be M&Ms, and all the green M&Ms would be removed. And people were like, what is this stupid rock star crazy behavior? And their reasoning was much more well thought out. They said, well, our tours are very complicated. There are pyrotechnics, there are special effects, there's all these things. And if they go wrong, we could be horribly injured or even killed. We don't want that to happen. So we have this clause about green M&Ms because it shows that they actually read the entire thing. Something we want them to do for safety purposes. And so if we go into our dressing room and we look through the M&Ms and we find the green M&Ms, it means these people are not paying attention. And that's time for us to go and say, hey, I want you to double check every single thing about this stage setup. And so this is, like you said, a green M&M moment, which is they're like, oh, well, there's this one little detail I could do that's not even that important. But the fact that I actually recognize that and act on that detail indicates that I am detail oriented and focused on the whole thing. So it's a halo effect where attention to detail reveals that you are attending to all the details.
Yeah, and also, like, I think what happens. So I think that's true, right? But I think it's also, like, from my perspective, I am communicating to you
Mm-hmm.
that I am attentive to you.
Yes,
And just that fact makes it lower stress, more pleasant for you to do this, and increases the ROI.
exactly. No, and again, just if the ROI, everyone focuses on the R, and the R is important, and you need to figure out a good R. But the I is equally important in the equation mathematically. And most people ignore the I because of the training they received when they were growing up.
Yeah. Okay. So a really important point here, or a really important question, is when should you try to be high ROI? Okay, because like the conversations the examples we've been using is like you and Reid Hoffman, me and you, me and like top political leaders. Like, obviously there's a hierarchy, and it's clear in these relationships who should be seeking to accommodate who. Of course, both people should be seeking to accommodate each other, but it's like who should be doing the heavy lifting is obvious. But there are other situations where it should be other people accommodating me,
Mhm.
right? Let's say when we have a team that works with us on this podcast, and I tell them like, hey, here's my work style, and you have to conform this work style. By the way, Chris, I don't force you to conform the work style. You probably even haven't seen it, right?
Yes,
But
that's
one of
right.
the things that you probably know about is everybody who works with us needs to be 10 minutes early all the time. They're always 10 minutes early, but not you, right? So there's this kind of like thing where it's like, Chris, you're on time. That's fine. I'm not forcing you to do that. I'm always 10 minutes early, but you can be on time. The other people are helping us. They need to conform to my 10-minute early rule.
Mm,
And so, 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 and that's in a way creating friction with them, right? So
right.
I have other goals with them other than being maximally high ROI. So like, when should you be high ROI? In what context? And what's the framework to figure that out?
Well, I think that the way to think about it is again the return on investment. In your case, when you are asking the members of the team to always be there 10 minutes early, then what's happening for them is they're making an investment of their time and they're getting a return. Like they've obviously chosen to work with you because they believe they can learn from you, because they're going to get to do cool stuff, because it's going to be helpful to them in the long run. And so in that case, the I is low enough that it makes sense for them to do that for your
Hmm.
sake. And sometimes you might do things the other way, right? There are times, and this is true with Reed, and this is probably true with me. At least I hope I've said this. Where it's like, well, if there's a way that I can make it more convenient, and it doesn't inconvenience me, I want to do that, right? Because I don't just sort of sail through life saying all that matters is my convenience. I care about other people's convenience as well. And I try to be as convenient as possible for other people, all other things being equal. It's just the right thing to do, to care about others. You can care and then also say, but in the end, this is going to cost me too much time or too much investment. And so I can't do it. But at least you have considered it. So I think that is the key, right? And you'll have these conversations. You probably had them with some of the folks you worked with in the past, where you might say, hey, here are a couple of different ways we could do it. And they would say, well, which one is best for you? I'm like, well, this option A would probably be best. And then they would say, okay, that doesn't actually cost me anything extra. Let's do option A. Because I think that, again, this is where the feedback comes in. Because you have been so high ROI for them in the past, even though you've been catering to their I and R, it is the case that they are so taken and so value the relationship, because it is one of the best relationships they have, because it helps them get things done, that they are going to in turn want to do things, even if they're slightly inconvenient, to maintain that relationship. Because you have invested into the relationship and made it valuable for them, they are now going to also invest in it.
Yeah, interesting. So I think the explicit framework is all interactions must be high ROI for everybody involved,
Mm-hmm.
but there's just like a natural kind of like value that is created by different people. So let's say in my relationship with you, you're just by participating creating more value for me than I'm creating for you by just participating. Therefore, I have to make up for it. When I'm working with the other
Mm-hmm.
people in other contexts, it might be different. It might be like, hey, look, just by working with you, I'm creating value for you. So you have to adapt to me so that it kind of evens back out.
Right.
Um, and so that would be the framework. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I have this expression I like to give, which is like everyone's a volunteer. Nobody is an indentured servant whom you can force to do things. And even if you're paying people, they're still a volunteer, because they're still choosing to accept money from you instead of from somebody else. So even though you may be the person in the higher status branch of the relationship, you still should think about the feelings of the other person, the ROI of the other person, because the more you're able to make it high ROI for them, including the piece that is based on your inherent power or fame or what have you, then the more likely it is that they'll stick with you. Because otherwise, suppose some other famous person, powerful person comes along and says, hey, can you
Yeah.
do this for me instead? The answer might be, oh, sayonara.
Yeah, I'm thinking of a really important, well, what I think is a really important way of achieving that, and I'd like to know what you think. So,
Hmm.
one of the things I'm trying to do more of, and have been for a little while, and I think I do a pretty good job of it now, is being as unopinionated as possible,
Hmm.
unless I actually feel strongly about something.
Right.
So, let's say, Chris, if you were like really opinionated about what our thumbnails look like,
Hmm.
I mean, you could, right? And I would adapt to it. But then, like, if you're constantly opinionated about all these small things, it creates so much friction for me. I'd be like, look, I'm not going to do this. It's too much
Right.
friction.
Exactly.
And then, so for you, you have like very few opinions. Just like, I trust you. You do all the stuff. When I do have an opinion, I feel strongly about it. I will let you know. And otherwise, I'm just going to be quiet. And I might have some preferences, but I'm not going to express them. Um, and that might, just not expressing your preferences might be, a key way to be higher ROI for the people who kind of are reporting into you in a certain way. They're like lower in the hierarchy. Like, is that right, or how would you
Yeah.
think of that?
Yeah. I think that that's a good way of thinking about it. Right. So each bit that you inconvenience someone else or that you request something from someone else increases the I on their part and reduces, therefore, the ROI on the relationship for them. And so when you are making these asks, recognize that there is a cost. Even if you're the higher status person, there is a cost to making those requests. And so you should only leverage that when it matters and not worry about the stuff that doesn't. I think there was a classic self help book called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff that I've never read, but it's a great expression. Don't sweat the small stuff. If the stuff doesn't matter, it doesn't matter.
So I will wrap this up by plugging your new TED Talk that people should
Ooh.
really find. So if they just go to YouTube and look up TED, Chris Yeh, or you posted on your social media accounts yesterday. So really, encourage folks to do that. Chris, it's been such an interesting conversation, a super non-obvious topic. I think no
Yeah.
one else ever, thinks about. So, amazing that, we have the opportunity to talk this through.
Yeah, and as pointed out, this is where the R comes in, the return. The reason why I do this podcast, besides the fact that it's good for branding because I get to spend time with you, is one of the reasons why I value spending time with you is that you think and you ask questions and you draw out, or even to return to something we talked about earlier, milk the insights from me in a way that other people do not. And so that is valuable in terms of the return. And because the investment is relatively low and painless, I'm more than happy to continue making it.
And actually, now that I think of it, make a really meta point. The reason we're talking about this is that I
Mm.
knew you want to talk about it because you mentioned it last week.
Mm.
So I knew that this would be a high ROI topic for you to discuss. So a very meta point here. Well, see everyone next week, and bye, Chris.
Goodbye, Julian.